In the mid-1960s, the world's smartest TV producers brought together 4 young musicians to create a TV show that was years ahead of its time. I'm talking, of course, about the Monkees. And you, comedy, music, pop culture nerd, probably love the show, but don't realize it. That's why I, Monkees superfan Takuro McCullough, sit down with a variety of guests to watch every Monkees episode and discuss their glory on the Monkees podcast. Whether you're already a fan or have never seen an episode, the Monkees podcast is for you, as we discuss the Monkees phenomenon, hilarious antics, and deep fandom. So check it out at monkeespodcast.com, that's PAWDCAST, or wherever podcasts are found.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quiller Nation. Thank you once again for choosing to be here. We're always so glad to have you. Tons of excitement here in the Quiller Nation about our guest for this episode, but before I welcome him to the program, I want to conduct a little bit of business as usual. First, I want to thank those of you who have taken the time to send me messages of congratulations on our Award of Excellence from the Academy of Interactive and Visual Arts in this year's 29th Annual Communicator Awards. We here at Don't Quill the Messenger and Dragon Wagon Radio try to remember every day that this award-winning podcast isn't possible without you, the listeners, and of course, our honored guests. Thank you all for your continued support. It means so much to all of us here, and it means so much to us to share being a part of the Quiller Nation with all of you. I also want to remind you of our inaugural meme contest that is going on until the end of May. Some of you have sent some fun and interesting memes our way, and we'd love to see some more come in. Not sure how to create a quick and easy meme? Well, there are plenty of free meme generators available. If you just do a quick little online search, they'll walk you right through the process of uploading your photo, adding some captions on top of it, and P.S. Bing, you have created a meme. Can't wait to see what else you all have in store for us, Quiller Nation. So send us those memes. Just a quick update about our plans to hold a gathering of the Quiller Nation next April 2024. We are currently working out the itinerary for the event to include informative presentations, live theatrical performances, social gatherings, and exciting side options in our location that we have determined, which we'll be sharing soon, I promise. Once the itinerary is set, we will be able to secure our dates and facilities and then get that information out there to you about how you can attend. If you want to stay completely up to date about all things Quiller in nature, be sure to follow our Facebook page. It's easy to find with a quick search of Facebook or through the link at our website, and you can stay up to date on the things that we're posting there, information, details, fun memes, and other stuff. You can also join our email newsletter by joining the subscriber list. It's easy to do. Just send me an email and I'll add you to the list. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. The growth of this Quiller Nation is both exciting and humbling all at once. It is incredible what we are doing together, especially over the past year or so now since our Patreon page went live. Remember, if you haven't visited that page, you can find it by clicking the red button on the homepage of our website to learn about how to support the show at different levels, how to access special bonus content, and how to qualify for the Quiller of the Month contest, just like this month's winner, Jen S. Thank you, Jen, for your loyal support, and we hope you enjoy your Quiller swag item from the Quiller Swag Shop. And now, my guest today, Quiller Nation, is the author Lee Durkee. He is the author of The Last Taxi Driver, named a Kirkus Review's Best Novel of 2021, and Rides of the Midway. His stories and essays have also appeared in Harper's, The Sun, Oxford American, Zoetrope, All Story, and Mississippi Noir. He lives in Oxford, Mississippi. Go figure. We're going to talk about that. And his new book by Simon & Schuster is called Stalking Shakespeare. Lee, welcome to the Quiller Nation.
Thrilled to be here, Stephen. Thank you for having me on. It's my first podcast.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad that we can anoint you in this proper way here on Don't Quill the Messenger. I was fortunate enough to receive a copy of your book from your rep at Simon & Schuster, Paul Samuelson, and I want to say a great thank you to Simon & Schuster, not only for reaching out for you and also Elizabeth Winkler, who's also been a guest on the program, but also I just want to applaud them for embracing what appears to be this new open mind to talking about what we would maybe call apocryphal books and novels on the topic of the Shakespeare authorship mystery.
Agreed. They took some chances. They really did. Simon & Schuster and Scribner. I'm under Scribner. Simon & Schuster is Elizabeth's company, but they're essentially under the same tent. Sometimes I think maybe the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing in the situation. And the books came out at the same time, which is both fortunate and unfortunate, and yeah, they both deal with the authorship debate, which has been taboo, as Elizabeth writes so eloquently about in her book.
Well, you venture out there too. I mean, you go out on a limb in this book in a variety of different ways, not just with the way you approach the Shakespeare mystery, but also how open and honest you are about your own journey and the things that you were struggling with in your life while you sort of did this deep dive into the rabbit hole of finding the true Shakespeare when it comes to all of the various paintings and images that you've hunted down and also included in your book.
Yeah, well, it covers a long period of time, almost 2 decades. My book was actually rejected by W.W. Norton on their editorial round, the final round 15 years ago. And that was, like the first 80 pages of it or something like that. Of the unfinished manuscript. And after that, it kind of went just underground forever. And so it encompasses a lot of time, and it is a very personal memoir. And even by, it's what I would call new journalism. It inserts the persona of the writer front and center into the book. And it tries to entertain, and it does so by being irreverent and hopefully funny. And it takes on the Shakespeare authorship debate in this light and all of the scandals, one after another, attached to the many portraits that are said to be William Shakespeare, painted from life. So there was no shortage of material, and it was a matter of actually narrowing it down to certain portraits and to certain episodes of my life. Whenever you write about yourself, whether it's in a novel form or in a memoir, you are crafting a persona. And there's a lot of that going on in the book. And I don't always concentrate on my better sides. It's an eccentric persona. And authority is a weird thing to arrive at when you approach a subject matter, and a serious subject matter, in that light. It's hopefully informed. It's not scholarly. I'm not a scholar. I know my limitations. And so I take everything I say with a grain of salt. It is the truth as I understand it. But yes, it does embrace the authorship question, which is rare for a major press.
I really love how you just described it as, sort of a new form of journalism, because I think that right now we've been in a place in the world, and particularly in this country, where we have a growing disdain for journalists because they're not doing a lot of journalism. They're doing a lot of pundit commentary and editorial opinion happening on both sides of every spectrum, as it turns out. And so I love that not only do you offer the book, and it's has this sort of first person account to it. It's a first person narrative, but you're also so self-deprecating in the book. You make no bones about taking shots at yourself in the mirror. And I think that's actually an interesting portrait, pardon the pun, when it comes to what the subject matter also is you hunting down all of these portraits of a man who has been so mysterious to us for, centuries. And I don't know that anyone has actually really pursued it this way ever before. And I think it's delightful. It's refreshing, and it's so informative, and it's not scholarly. I think there's been too many scholarly books on this topic, and we need more books like yours. And as you mentioned, Elizabeth Winkler, and I felt the same way about her book and the first person narrative that she chose in her book. And I think that these two books coming out together at this similar time has sort of like crashed open the door of this topic in a way that new readers are going to find it and enjoy.
I hope so. I mean, Elizabeth's book just got a wonderful review in the Washington Post, and deserved. I mean, I just got it in the mail 2 days ago, so I've only started to read it, but I'm reading it just with a certain amount of awe, in that she seems to me the author that the traditionalists have been terrified would appear on the screen. This feminist, super intelligent approach to the behavior of the white male scholars is refreshing. And I think they're very afraid of her, and I think they're going to retaliate against her much more than they're going to retaliate against me. In a sense, I'm guarded and protected by humor, satire, and persona. Whereas Elizabeth is waiting out there without her armor, rather like Sir Philip Sidney. And and I worry that there might be a backlash against her. And I hope I'm not officially an Oxfordian, though obviously I have leanings in that direction. And I hope the Oxfordians are smart enough to have Elizabeth's back, because she's going to have to deal with a lot of mean comments, et cetera. And it's not going to be easy. I think she's very brave.
Well, along those lines, getting back to you and your book, yours did release before hers. And so it's been out for a bit, and you've received some responses. Tell us about some of the early feedback, early responses you've received. I did see the review in, I think it was the New York Times, and I thought it was a very kind review with regards to your writing, and honest about the style and how enjoyable the book is. Of course, they couldn't resist throwing a few barbs your way near the end of it all about the Oxfordian position and the authorship mystery. But tell us about some of the other feedback and responses you've been receiving.
Well, as to the New York Times review, it was written by the artistic director of the Globe Theater. So in a sense, they threw me to the wolves, because my book, as you know, just parodies, ridicules, satires the Shakespeare tourist industry. So that review could have been career ending, and it wasn't. Mr. Drumgoole was class enough to give it a rave review, in spite of the fact he did not approve of the avenues I stumbled down in the authorship debate. And that's fair enough as far as I'm concerned, though strictly looking at it from the point of view of authorship, maybe it wasn't entirely fair in that treatment, but I was thrilled with it. This morning, I had a even more rave review in the Washington Post, and written by Malcolm Forbes, and without a word of criticism, and it included the authorship as discussion as in a complimentary fashion, although it called it radical. So other than that, Garden is Gun gave it a really strong review, and see what else happens. The comment sections on my Twitter feed have not all been friendly, but you know, but all in all, it's been interesting. And so far, so good. I was really worried about the Washington Post review because I take on the Folger Shakespeare Library in what I think is a playful way. But I do call them to task on the Ashbourne portrait, right? And I was worried that perhaps the Washington Post would be in a protective mode for the Folger Library, which would have been fair enough, and would not write me the kindest review in the world. And just the opposite happened this morning. So I had a good morning with that, and I can hopefully relax now and enjoy the publication of the book now that that review has hit the press.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that the social media trolls have come after you to some degree. That's very commonplace in the world of Shakespeare authorship skepticism. But, many of us have learned that we just sort of duck to water, let it roll off our backs, because it tends to be the same loud voices who, for whatever reason, are just so threatened by this topic and this issue and the idea that anyone dare ask a question about the god of their idolatry. But I love how you describe yourself, as this sort of dilettante with nothing to lose. The descriptions of the book call you the Dan Brown of English portraiture. And I kind of love that comparison as well. But one of the things I really love is that it says very clearly here is that you became the adversary that many of the locations that hold these portraits didn't know they had. And what I would add to that is didn't know they needed, because I think they needed someone like you to come and hold them in check, especially the Folger Library. It wasn't that long ago, April 23rd rolled around, and, the traditional view of the birth date of William Shakespeare, and the many of the posts and social media feeds that I saw included that same portrait, and they still just keep getting it wrong. And I laughed particularly, and I thought specifically of you, that, here's this book that has proven over and over again what we've already seen proven before about this portrait, and they still keep advancing this mythology.
Yeah, I don't see what choice they have. These institutions are not going to change, and their attitude towards me has been both good and bad, depending on the institution. But within even the Royal Collection, there have been curators who've been helpful. When I harassed them enough, they've agreed to X-ray portraits even, and I appreciate that. So I don't want to give a blanket condemnation of any one institution. Sometimes they've behaved well, sometimes not so well. But what I've learned is that there is a caste system of information in America. And if I'm a bartender and a cab driver, and that would be considered lower middle class at best, somebody who survives in the gig economy or whatever. And I don't have access to all these academic databases that are out there. And when I write to museums requesting information about a portrait's costume or history, sometimes I get helpful replies, and sometimes I get no replies at all. So there is a wall between people like me and information. And it's a caste system of information, which is why I dedicated the book to Aaron Swartz, who really just, he was a young genius who helped found Reddit. He invented the RSS feed. And then he decided he was going to make Juster, the academic database, available to everybody by going into the MIT library and releasing all that information onto the web. And he was arrested by the MIT police, and they made an example of him. They charged him with up to 30 years in prison and $1 million fine, and which was just an obscene thing to do. And Aaron killed himself, which is horrible tragedy. And he was trying to make that type of information available to people like me. And he gave his life on that cause. So I just want to remember him, and also say that, yes, museums sometimes were brilliant. I got a lot of good information and a lot of friendly responses from museums, but I also exasperated them. I'm a little OCD. And, I'm sure their attitude was that no matter how much information we give him, he's just going to write us back that same afternoon wanting more. And at a certain point, we have to do other aspects of our job. So I'm also sympathetic to their plight, in dealing with me. I could be a little bit too annoying. And I've gone back and read some of my emails and have just winced at them. I was not always the kind person I should be. So, there's fault on both sides.
So you're telling us you had to break a few eggs to make this omelet. Is that sort of the assessment there?
Yeah, I made some enemies and I made some friends. And the whole process was the most torturous thing I've ever been through in my life, because the book got picked up right when COVID lockdown hit. And everybody at Scribner immediately fled their offices to their home. There was this, and so there was this great restructuring of corporate America. And my editor was young. She had just moved to New York. She was a good editor, but she couldn't really handle the whole COVID thing and what was going on in New York. And she fled and quit the job. So my book was orphaned. Every book I've ever published has been orphaned. And the next 3 years, it was 3 years of COVID delays because they wanted to publish it in China, right? And because of all the illustrations and plates. And 3 years of delay means 3 years of extra work for the author, full-time work. And it was just excruciating and torturous what my agent, Dan Kirshen, and I went through to get this book to the press. And I never want to go through anything half that difficult again in my life. So I wish the book good luck. But a part of me is also thinking, I'm looking forward to having Shakespeare in the rear view.
I can understand that, especially if it resulted in such a traumatic experience for you. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it was going to be one of the questions I asked you was, what were some of the more challenging moments? But shifting gears from the whole COVID aspect and the lockdown and some of that plays out, you are very frank about some of that in the pages of the book. But tell me more about which of the portraits you were hunting down, or which of the museums, or which of the locations that you were trying to get to cooperate, where you just kept hitting a wall and finally there was some sort of a breakthrough.
A breakthrough? Wow. That would happen with different portraits at different times, but mostly I hit walls. I mean, you've read the book. It's not a book of I will tell you all. It's a book about the process of trying to get answers and often failing. And sometimes, it was waiting a year or two for an X-ray result, and the X-ray result was not the X-ray result you wanted, or you get an X-ray result and you realize you're not even qualified to read this X-ray in some level, and things like that. I would say the Vulture Library was by far the most helpful institution. Aaron Blake was friendly, nice, patient, informed, everything you would want. The only problem with the Vulture was they have this trustee statement that prohibits spectral testing X-rays unless there's a public outcry for them. And that's only happened twice in their history, and with the Jansen portrait and the Ashbourne portrait. So they have this whole horde of Shakespeare portraits that are fascinating portraits, and they don't test them. And they're a research library, so maybe they should. And that's the only thing I'm calling out the Vulture on. Other than that, they have a great online gallery. They make their images available for free. I had to pay thousands of dollars to the National Portrait Gallery and other places to print these in my book, even though they're public domain images. In England, the attitude is, yes, they're public domain images, but the photographs of them, which are rote photographs, they claim are works of art unto themselves. Therefore, the photographs which they guard are not public domain, and it's just a loophole they're getting away with, and it's crap. If you'll excuse my add-on, it's it's transparently wrong. And yet they cling to this loophole in order to guard their images.
I don't know
that doesn't
that
happen in America.
I don't know that I was ever aware of that, and that's a really important aspect of the hunt, the super sleuthing that you had to do here. But I also don't discredit yourself as being such a clever wordsmith, because I don't know that I've ever heard anyone describe the word crap as transparently wrong, like you just did, which I love.
Well, it occurred to me I don't know the policy of cursing, and
we get pissed off around here often, and throw some words around. Right. So it's quite all right. The establishment definitely deserves our ire from time to time. What about a moment? And obviously I know some of the answers here, but I just want my readers to get a little taste of the book since they don't have it in their hands yet. And we'll explain to them where to find it. Ladies and gentlemen, find it. It's called Stalking Shakespeare. It's not hard to locate. It's at all the booksellers, and it's readily available from Scribner through, as Lee pointed out, is under the umbrella of Simon & Schuster. And Stalking Shakespeare, it's a simple title. There is a subtitle, A Memoir of Madness, Murder, and My Search for the Poet Beneath the Paint, which I love that description as well. But how about one of your favorite moments of discovery, something you didn't expect to find, something that really shocked you, blew your mind, that then kind of created another chapter for the book?
Okay. To me, the most intriguing portrait I came upon, and I don't think the Oxfordians in general will agree with me on this, but I kind of want to convert them on it, although converting is always a sketchy process, right?
Yes, indeed.
The Hunt portrait. Yeah. And the Hunt portrait, also known as the Stratford portrait, was discovered in 1860 in a Stratford attic, and it was purposely disguised with a caricature beard covering the entire face. Now, the guy who discovered it had just cleaned the Stratford bust the day before or the week before, and had been hired to look into this attic. And all these portraits were already at least 100 years old. So that takes it back to the 18th century. And we don't know how old the Stratford or the Hunt portrait is. But back in the 19th century, when it was discovered, there was a huge debate over which came first, the Hunt portrait or the Stratford bust. They were obviously related to each other. They were almost identical images, and one of them was used to create the other. And back then, a lot of people, a lot of major newspapers came down inside of saying the portrait came first and was used to create the bust. Now, the images of the portraits are very guarded. By the Stratford, it's owned by the Stratford Birthplace Trust, and they don't display it. They guard the images of it. I wasn't allowed to use. It's tough to get a good photograph of the Hunt portrait. I had to go back to a book that was published in the, I believe, 19th century to do that. 18th century actually, and the resemblance I see, which is fairly stark, is a resemblance to Edward de Vere. A rather uncanny resemblance. And I wonder if that resemblance might be a reason that the portrait has never been tested in any way. I don't think it's even been cleaned since it was given to the town of Stratford. It's certainly, in my amateur eyes, desperately in need of cleaning. I went to Stratford and visited it. And when I showed up at the Stratford Birthplace Trust, they didn't even know what the portrait was. They didn't know where it was. Anyway, to get back to your question, when I first started interrogating them about the portrait, I had to supply them with its history. They didn't know it. Their files on that were empty. And there's a lot of intrigue about this portrait that I'll leave most of it for the book because it's very complicated and fascinating. But then they inform me, well, anyway, we have it scheduled for test. The conservation is coming up. We're going to infrared it, and we'll let you see the results. And I was as excited as I've ever been during my decades of searching for Shakespeare. I thought, finally, we're going to get some great results here. And time went on. Eventually, I kept writing them back. What's going on with these tests? And they were, well, we've delayed it, but it's not canceled. And then on the day I visited the portrait, which is a much more moving portrait than I expected it to be, the young curator there just kind of shrugged and said, they canceled the tests. They canceled the conservation. So what happened in a nutshell was I filled up their folder with information about the history of their portrait that they didn't know. And their response to that, for whatever reason, and they claimed the reason was financial, they canceled the tests that were already scheduled on it. And I find that strange response.
I actually am not surprised by that at all, because first, I'm not surprised that they didn't know exactly what they had, because they don't ever really want to know what they have. They want to fantasize about what they have and create from whole cloth whatever it is that they believe that will help sell their bill of goods to the general public and continue raking in the tourism dollars. So that doesn't surprise me at all. And it doesn't surprise me that once you clued them in to what it was that they had, and that there could be some doubt about it actually being a picture of William of Stratford, they did not want to learn any more than what you have already brought to them, which was, I think, opening the door of skepticism that they never want to see opened.
No, I don't think anybody's accusing them of being open-minded, right? Their job is to promote a product, is to move units, right? They're a business. And they want the Cobb portrait because it's sponge-worthy Shakespeare. It's Shakespeare as a soap opera doctor. It's the beautiful Shakespeare everybody desires, even though the entire argument behind the Cobb portrait is pretty transparent in itself. It's very likely a portrait of Thomas Overbury. I think most informed people agree with that. Certainly, the experts have weighed in and at times ridiculed the choice of the Stratford Birthplace Trust as a portrait of Shakespeare painted from life. It's the resemblance is simply not there. Nothing really advocates for it, except it was found in a collection descended from the third Earl of Southampton. And that in itself is just like 6 or 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? Yeah. It's not in any way conclusive proof. And also the other argument for the Cobb portrait is that they believe the Jansen portrait of Shakespeare was a copy of it, an early copy of it. And yet the Jansen portrait of Shakespeare was called into question by its own curators at the Volger Library, who believe it's a portrait of Thomas Overbury. And we're not even sure that it's the same person or that one's a copy of another. They look quite different to me in certain regards. And one of them is wearing a collar, a whisk collar that has the Tudor Rose design. That would be the Jansen portrait, whereas the Cobb portrait has the thistle design associated with King James I. So to say that they're even the same sitter is a bit of a stretch. So there's a lot of holes in that argument, but it doesn't really matter because, as I say in my book, it's not as if experts are deciding it anymore. What now Google decides what the Shakespeare we want. And if you Google Shakespeare, you'll see the Cobb portrait left and right, even though it's been ridiculed by experts. So it's an uphill battle against the Cobb portrait, and I really despise that portrait, and I try to be objective in my treatment of it. But I don't like what's going on behind the marketing of that portrait.
I don't blame you, and I think that one of the parallels there that I have come to find prevalent in my own belief system about all of this now is that it is destined to be that way because it was destined to be that way. I believe that when you create a pen name like William Shakespeare, Willie the poet I am, Shakespeare, which I think is tantamount to Mark Twain. I mean, I think it's a silly, funny pen name that was never meant to be more than that, but it was meant to be a brand. And I think it has been a brand and will remain a brand forever. I think that the inventors of that brand were brilliant, and they're better than Anheuser-Busch for certain. Look what they've been able to accomplish and maintain for centuries now. I think it's the greatest brand ever invented. And so now you have these images associated with that brand, and it's so difficult to break those images away. It'd be like trying to have a reference to Disneyland without Mickey Mouse being involved.
Exactly. What you said, I support. The first folio was a deification. It was PR. It was taking this author and making this author into a god. They did it so well. The Elizabethans were smart and admirable. And I point out in the book, one of the reasons we can't solve this mystery is because the Elizabethans were smarter than we are. I mean, they had an education beaten into them. And, that creates a very strange and brilliant mind. I do think it's a brand, Shakespeare. And unlike most people, I don't see one consistent voice running through it, which is why I come up with what I call the Dread Pirate Roberts theory of Shakespeare's studies, and that I think Shakespeare was a bit of a revolving door involving multiple geniuses, a lot of collaboration, more than we wanted to admit, because you can't market collaboration, right? Everybody wants just this one genius that you can put on a coffee mug and a T-shirt that you can make a movie about. And I don't think it was that simple. I think Shakespeare was a brand that went on for years. I think a lot of people influenced the brand. But I also recognize why that's not an attractive argument for a lot of people. And I'm also curious as to who is the overseeing figure of this brand. If we look at Shakespeare as an Elizabethan corporation, who is in charge of that corporation? And my book delves into that question a little bit too, dealing with the Fulk Greville argument, who was a master of public relationships, a man who was just steeped in literature. His whole life was revolved around literature. You can prove he was a genius. He was a genius on every level, whether it's playwriting or poetry or essays. And he said that he wanted to be remembered as the master of Shakespeare. Now, what does that mean, master of Shakespeare? It's a very intriguing statement. And we can do a little bit of research, and he doesn't mean schoolmaster. And so he must mean patron, organizer, person who maybe had final draft. His job, he was Queen Elizabeth's best friend, and he died the richest man in England, or the second richest man. And he was a very admirable person. He was part of Essex House in the Protestant rebellion that rose out of there. And he saved the third Earl of Southampton's life, and went on to become Queen Elizabeth's longest standing close friend. And he was incredibly powerful because of that. And he refused to publish his own works. And he stated, he made sure we knew that when his works finally were published, they were going to come down to us with other people's names attached to them, and they were going to be altered, which is fascinating. And his relationship with the curating of the Shakespeare brand is something I don't think has been looked into enough. Interestingly enough, he also bought, King's Landing or King's Place or De Vere's Last Home in Hackney. And in buying De Vere's Last Home, it's kind of intriguing to see what else came with that house, right? And so I didn't want my book to just be one-sided, like, oh, De Vere. I think the argument is still open to debate. And I think I don't look at Fulk Greville as the guy who wrote To Be or Not to Be, but I think Fulk Greville was up to his neck in Shakespeare, and he made people famous for a living. He made the Earl of Essex famous. His job was PR at Essex House. And then he made Sir Philip Sidney famous upon his death, rewrote and republished Sidney's poems, turned Sidney into a god. Meanwhile, he marketed himself as the friend of Sidney and became world famous as the friend of Sir Philip Sidney. He knew how to market fame. He was obsessed with fame. And my question in the book is, did he create, another famous creature from scratch? Was he the great patron that oversaw Shakespeare, whatever Shakespeare was? And we know he worked with all the writers associated with Shakespeare, including my hero, Thomas Nash. So most of my information on Greville comes from a book called The Master of Shakespeare, Volume 1 by A.W.L. Saunders. It's really written by Renee Greville, who is a descendant of Greville's. And it's a book worth reading, and is compatible with the Oxford argument. It's not at war with it, I don't think, though Renee Greville might disagree with me on that.
I think what we're finding more and more as we move deeper through this mystery and find more and more information and try to solve it, that it truly is, and I don't think I've heard anyone quite describe it the way you just did, but it truly is an Elizabethan corporation. And so in that sense, then I think what we're looking for, I think so many people, including there are Orthodox scholars now who are leaning more towards, group work theory, collaborative names and pens to certain of the plays. And I think that what we've been searching for, perhaps, and I'm guilty of this as well, because I have theorized that Edward de Vere was the editor-in-chief of this group of Algonquin club writers that would all get together, drink way too much wine. In fact, I envisioned that the name William Shakespeare was invented in a night of drunkenness as they teased and joked about what kind of name they would use. But I think you've just hit on something that goes a little further. There has to be more than just an editor-in-chief. There needs to be a CEO. There needs to be a CFO. And we know that Edward de Vere was certainly not good with money, so I don't know that I would have chosen him to be the chief financial officer of the Shakespeare Corporation. But maybe you're onto something that, you had a president, you had a financial backer, you had a brilliant, genius, creative mind, artist mind, and then all these other writers all working together to create this corporation, this brand. And that might be why the answer to the mystery has been so elusive.
Yeah, it has been elusive. And I think that people don't like complicated answers, right? They want some sort of simplicity thrown at them that they can embrace. And in America, at least, when something gets complicated, it gets lost to the general public. And I don't think the answer is simple. I think in an age of collaboration, and you're right, scholars are coming around to that thesis more and more, just like they're finally admitting Shakespeare feverishly rewrote his work, which of course he did, but they resisted admitting that for so long. So yeah, collaboration was how plays were written. Even Ben Jonson admitted in print, he bragged in print once about having written a play all by himself. Now, that's pretty interesting, right? Because we think of Ben Jonson as the only sole genius we could compare to Shakespeare. And here he is bragging about having written a play without, 4 or 5 other friends, who had very specific jobs within the construction line that created these plays, the conveyor belt. And so I think traditional scholars are admitting that. One thing they're admitting is the Tom Nash influence on Shakespeare more and more. And they're admitting that Tom Nash was the most famous writer of the 1590s. And he owned that decade. I tried to write my book in the style of Tom Nash. Tom Nash is my hero. And I'm more than aware, especially of late, that there is an Oxfordian argument that Tom Nash himself was a pen name. And along those lines, I sympathize with the Stratfordians because I resist that for no other reason than confirmation bias, right?
Okay.
I want Tom Nash to be real. I love him, so in a sense, I'm guilty too of confirmation bias, and my book is a lot about, deals with confirmation bias left and right. You can be aware of confirmation bias and still suffer from it, and just being aware of it doesn't make you immune.
No, I agree with you, but I do think that it is refreshing that it's admitted when it's present as opposed to ignored or refuted the way that it often can be. And so there's nothing wrong with you confessing. And that's, again, it's one of the styles of your book that I just love so much is, you truly do look at yourself in the mirror and you paint out for us through the book in many cases and in many ways your own pimples, as it were, and gray hairs, and you let us see a little bit into your soul, which I think is also so helpful in wanting to follow you in the journey. You sort of become the hero of your own book. And you're not, you're just as flawed as Edward de Vere or any other real human being, as opposed to,
that's saying something.
William of Stratford, who apparently had no flaws. He was just brilliant and, came fully fledged like Athena out of the skull of Zeus. You know what I mean? So that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book. And I think that that's something that my listeners are going to enjoy too when they get a copy. I did want to ask you, I have this advanced copy in my hand here. And, as is often the case with advanced copies, they're not exactly what is going to be out there on the shelves. And I just had a question for you about the quality of the images in the book. And I'm hoping that they're at a higher level in the actual copies coming off the shelves than what I'm holding in my hand. Do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, that you're dealing with a galley, and galleys essentially look like they were made with Xerox machines from the 1970s. So yeah, the images are much better, and the center plates are stunning in their own right. The Scribner did a wonderful job on the 18 center plates in color, which of course they're not in color in your version either.
Okay, great. That was a question I had.
So yeah, I was worried about that too. And they came through on that front. But when I first saw the galleys, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want this, I don't want this to be my first impression. And, you simply, because of financial reasons, they have to do it that way. I'm not criticizing Scribner. I'm just saying, that's just the way it is on galleys. But it's less than impressive on the galleys. So thanks for having patience with that. And yes, the final product does not resemble the galleys in any way. Thank God. I wanted to backtrack to something you said earlier about the style of the book and the way I wrote it. I tried to write it from and this might be too obvious to state even, but I tried to write it from the point of view of the fool. Shakespeare loved fools, and fools serve a very important purpose, not only then, but now. And fools make fun of themselves a lot, but fools also poke fun at power, and which is a dangerous thing to do. You can end up in the stocks pretty quickly. Because when you poke at power, power doesn't poke back. Power crushes you, right? So it's a very dangerous game to play, to take the role of the fool. But the rule is that if you make power laugh, if you make the king laugh and you make the king think, then you get to go on living. And so that was the kind of roll of the dice I took in this book. I purposely turned myself into the fool, into a Shakespearean fool, stumbling down all these avenues of portraiture and authorship and everything else. And so far it's working, like even the New York Times review, when they criticized me for delving into the authorship debate, and they criticized me pretty sharply on that and nothing else. They made a point of forgiving me, right? They forgave the fool because I made them laugh and maybe made them think. And so that's the gamble you take when you take that role.
So you live to tell another joke another day. Is that sort of the goal?
Yeah, write another book.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I honestly thought it was going to be career ending with the New York Times review and maybe the Washington Post review. I was ready for that and knew that's what I was, that was a possibility. I'd had a friend who had his career destroyed by the New York Times book review. They put his book on the cover of the book review and then tore it apart. And I was at his house the next day, and he could not quit weeping. And so that's always been in the back of my mind. It is a gamble, and and it's not always a fair result.
Well, I think that, again, like I mentioned earlier, I think that the approach of this, personal journey is something that you and Elizabeth both share in your books together. And I think that that's a difference that we haven't seen in other books that have touched on this topic before. You're not this, austere voice of scholardom telling us how it is and what you and this citation, and I learned this here and you should learn this too. It's not preachy. It's so educational, informative, but it's so Socratic in its style that we're learning without knowing that we're learning until, as you say, we suddenly wake up and go, I'm thinking, and I didn't intend to, or I wasn't expecting to think the way I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, well, I think maybe the tide might be shifting. I think the white male scholars of old are losing power. Identity politics, identity criticism is coming in. And suddenly those scholars are the ones being examined in interesting ways that I'm sure they don't enjoy. But you can hardly feel sorry for them because they've been so mean-spirited and ruthless for so long, and they've avoided the debate forever. So I think I'm seeing this on Twitter and social media, that there is a rising tide of young Oxfordians and authorship heretics coming up, and they seem to have a good sense of humor, and they don't, in general, I don't think this new generation shares the prejudices against the authorship debate that the previous generation had. So I think there's reason to be hopeful, but I also expect a backlash of some sort. It's just going to make the Stratfordians more mean-spirited, I think. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe they'll just fold their cards. Who knows?
Well, we can only hope. I don't know if that's going to happen, but we can only hope. Now, you mentioned that it was difficult at times to obtain some of these images in the book. And when you go into a book like this, where going in for a fact that you're going to require access to images, was it ever frightening along the way of like, well, what happens if I can't get these pictures, or I can't get good enough pictures? The book can live or die on that, can't it? And how did that haunt you through the process?
Terribly, and all the way through the process. The Royal Collection refused to let me use their images to purchase them for publication unless I let them read and approve the manuscript first. Can you believe that?
No way.
I mean, how presumptuous is that?
Wow.
Yeah, I've got the email that says that. No uncertain terms. They're not going to sell me the images. They need to proofread my work first. And that was the last they ever heard of me. So I just bought old books that were out of public domain and scanned them. I know the law about public domain images, and I tried to go about it where they would actually get some money from me, which was more than fair because these images are public domain. And when they gave me that line, I was just like, okay, yes, that's how y'all want to play. I know I'll just buy old books and use those images, and that's what I did. So, but in another way, it was an effective ploy on their part, because I used less of their images than I would have otherwise. So it worked on some images. There is a portrait I'm really enamored with of Mark Rizzio, the fiddler who had an affair with Mary Queen of Scots, that I don't think is Mark Rizzio at all. I think it's related to Shakespeare. It's wearing the same signet ring as the Ashbourne. It has an uncanny resemblance to Shakespeare. It's been overpainted and altered in very strange ways by the Royal Collection. And I left it out of the book because it would have required a lot of portrait comparisons, and I simply could not get the sidestep the public domain issue on that portrait. So there was a lot of frustration with the Royal Collection, and yet there were curators for the Royal Collection who were extremely helpful over the years. So I'm torn both ways. These are giant institutions, and at times they're going to behave that way, and at times they behave with a very human side. And I've had both those experiences with the Royal Collection. So I don't want to blanket them with criticism.
It's so difficult for so many of us, me and particularly and the listeners of this program now in our 5th season. It's so difficult for us to accept that we still live in a world where that sort of totalitarian censorship is still allowable and still exists. Who do they think they are? Queen Elizabeth herself? I mean, my word, it's just astounding to me that they want to have that kind of control, that there are people in the world in this, and it happens on both sides too. And I'm sure you've run into that because I know I have many times, that, there are people in both sides of this camp and this argument who just have dug in their nails to hold on to whatever power or control they have over this. And it just baffles me so much that we still experience that on so many levels.
Yeah. I mean, my book, deals with a lot of paranoid thoughts in terms of my persona, but one of them is why exactly is the Royal Collection so invested in this? And are they hiding something? Why do they care so much about Shakespeare? And maybe they don't. Maybe it's just my perception, right? But I dwell on that in the book, and I still dwell on that. And yet I'm going to defend them again. I'm an eccentric person. A lot of my arguments to them have been wrong, have been silly in retrospect. I've been doing this for decades, and I learned as I went along. So their patience with me probably was exasperated pretty early on. And so, they're protecting their images, and they don't want some eccentric Mississippi cab driver writing about them. Now, I don't know if that's defensible or not, but I'm sure that has a little bit to do from their point of view. And that was their attitude. And for right or wrong, there were ways to sidestep those images and get them anyway. So it would have, there were more images I wanted to include, yes, but the book played out the way it played out, and no harm, no foul.
There were times as I was going through that especially because I do have, a galley-proof copy. So there were times when I was going through when I would run to my computer and search for some of these images. I wanted to see them in full bright color and in more detail and be able to enlarge them and really get into some of the imagery that is included in portraiture, especially during that time. You mentioned a signet ring earlier, and you've mentioned the differences in collars, and oftentimes whatever a person in the portrait is holding in their hand tells us 1,000 things more than what their face is telling us in the portrait. And a lot of times I think people look at portraits and they don't realize that there are so many other hidden clues and not even hidden, they're just there, but we don't know how to read them, right? I think portraits are in themselves a statement in many ways about so many things happening at the period of time, not just in the person's life, and I'm wondering, and I don't know if because this is out of my realm, but is there a way, do you see a way where you might put all these images in one place, one website, or a compendium of some sort where people might, while reading the book, be able to go visit there and do what I was trying to do one by one?
Well, I've tried my best on that, to do that with a blog I've had going for decades called Curious Portraits of Dead Elizabethans. And it's a blog that's concerned with portraits related to the Elizabethans, and specifically with Shakespeare and Shakespeare's ilk. And I've tried to encourage other people to take up the hobby that I took up, and that's how I got into it. I took up the hobby, learning how to identify portrait miniatures, because I was astounded how many of them were unidentified, and I wanted to know who they were. So my blog has a lot of, a lot of images available. And if you click on the images, you get bigger close-ups. And in a lot of ways, a blog is a perfect way to make a lot of these arguments, like the Mark Rizzio portrait that I'm infatuated with is dealt with on the blog in a way you probably could not have done in a book because it requires so many image comparisons, et cetera. Wiki Commons is the best route to go. They have the largest images available, and they've been a godsend to me. If you just go to their search engine for their images, you'll come up with a lot of great images. But a lot of these images are not, as you mentioned, available. And that's on purpose. They don't want you having them. They want to be able to sell them and market them, and because they're a commodity. And when I first got into this game, I would it was back then it was popular. You could zoom in on a certain part of the portrait, but not on the entire portrait. And I would zoom in on the portrait, take a photograph, zoom in on the next part of the portrait, take another photograph, and do that about 50 to 60 times, and then sew all those images together into a quilt. And I would have a large JPEG. And that's what I had to go through in order to get a large enough JPEG to study that portrait. And that was frustrating, but those images are guarded, and they're guarded for a reason. And maybe that will change someday, but it hasn't changed in the decades I've been playing the game of Shakespeare.
Well, and I think in some cases they're guarded because of the narrative that is being told or that they're trying to prevent from being told. And just a case in point, a lot of people involved in the Shakespeare authorship mystery point to the famous Titian painting of Venus and Adonis with his cap, which is mentioned very specifically in the Shakespeare poem Venus and Adonis. And the argument is, well, the only way that the author could have known that is if he'd seen that painting. Well, you go searching online for the version of the painting that includes Adonis with the cap, and it is becoming more and more difficult to find that image. You're instead finding the other version without the cap. And that's just one example. Yeah,
without the Sugarloaf cap. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
That is just one example of how it's becoming more and more difficult to hunt down some of these images that tell a different story than the traditional narrative.
Right. But on the other hand, we have virtual galleries now available to us that make anybody have access to portraits that have been kept in storage containers for centuries, right? Suddenly you can go online and access these portraits. And so there are still portraits related to Shakespeare out there. I believe that very strongly. And I encourage other people to get into this because we have this database of portraits now that has never been available before. And there are any number of portraits of Shakespeare or possible portraits of Shakespeare I left out of this book. And I'm sure there are many I overlooked entirely. So I encourage people to take up the hobby of portrait identification. And if you're looking for Shakespeare, the first thing you should do is learn how to costume date portraits. It's not as hard as you think. In fact, there's a most popular page in my blog. I teach you how to do this. And it's not overwhelmingly hard. And you can date almost any portrait within 5 or 6 years. And that is step one. And once you learn how to do that, you have a tremendous advantage over everybody in the game because not even curators know how to date portraits by costume. There's just curators are in charge of so many portraits, they cannot be specialists. So they don't know the details about costume, and they can't really inform you on that unless they have one person who is in charge of that, such as they do at the Victoria and Albert. So step one, if you want to get into this game, and I encourage people to do this, learn about costume dating. It will save you so much time and energy. Step two is never believe in an inscription. Never believe in inscription. They're added later, typically. They can be very misleading. You're dealing with overpaint. And other than that, trust your instincts, do what research you can do into the history of the portrait, and have fun with it. It is a delightful hobby.
At the beginning of all of this, Lee, you said quite openly and frankly that you are not a scholar. And I have to say now, having had this conversation with you, that I absolutely disagree. I say regularly on this program with many of my guests, the amount of hours that you have spent on this topic certainly would equate to, at the minimum, a master's degree in this, if there were such a course offered at some university. So I think you're very much a scholar. I think you might even be America's most preeminent expert in this, based on the thousands of hours that you must have spent in this field and learning how to be an expert in this field. And I think that you encouraging others to get involved is great, but I would also say to them all, go to the expert if you need assistance. You can tell people how they can find your blog and how they can find you.
This is called Curious Portraits of Dead Elizabethans. You can Google it. I also have a Substack which has much of the same information on it. You can get. I'm available via Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. But like most writers on these social media machines you don't necessarily approve of, in order to do something called self-promotion, which is distasteful, yet it's part of the game as well. So I'm not hard to find, and I do respond to questions, and especially ones about portraits, but quite often I won't know the answer. I think I'm somebody with serious limitations, and but I might be able to advise you on how to find the answers. So thank you for saying that, by the way. It was very kind and generous. I read Harold Bloom a lot, even though I don't agree with him.
So
and the
do
reason
I
I read Harold Bloom, who seems quite often insane to me, is because I love his brand of insanity. His mind is fascinating, right? And he says things I don't agree with, and he hates people like me probably. But I read him because I find his mind entertaining. When he says things like the Macbeths have the best marriage in Shakespeare, you think, wow, I never thought about that before. That's interesting. And I read. I've lived on both sides of the debate. Throughout my many years, like a lot of people, I migrated from one side of the debate to the other over the years. And what I would like to preach is a little bit of patience on both sides, because the Oxfordians are in a sense abused kids, right? They've grown up being abused, treated terribly by the traditionalists, the Stratfordians. And abused kids also grow up to be abusers sometimes. And I've noticed that the Oxfordians really love me when I agree with them. But when I disagree with them, such as on the Hampton Court portrait, such as on the Gerhardt's portrait of Edward de Vere, they suddenly turn mean-spirited and start acting just like Stratfordians do. So I'm hoping this new generation of authorship heretics has a better sense of humor and doesn't disown people the moment they disagree with them on one subject or another. People are not always at their best behavior online, and I don't know all of these people in person, and many of them are probably fabulous people in person, but online they can be very abrasive if you take an argument that they don't like. And I do embrace arguments the Oxfordians don't like. I'm much more fond of the Drew Shute engraving than they are. I'm much more intrigued by the Stratford bust and think it might be related to a tribute to De Vere. And that's, that breaks down the Oxfordian mythology. And they have their own mythology in which that's all highly part of the enemy camp, the Drew Shute and the Stratford bust. And I don't necessarily agree with that. And I should be allowed to disagree with him without being called names. And I hope that both sides of the debate become more civil in the future.
You're absolutely preaching to the choir here on Don't Quill the Messenger, because that has been a mantra here for quite some time. And you've hit the nail completely on the head with regards to, I love that metaphor too, abused children grow up to be abusers. I think that that is so accurate and profound. And I hope that I know that there are those in the camp who have chosen to denounce this very program because I offer guests and opinions and viewpoints that they don't subscribe to or that they feel are too lunatic fringe or whatever they want to call it. But I know they're still closet listeners, and I hope they heard and will take to heart the words that you just shared, because I think it's super important that we all learn to be more accepting and learn to be more willing to open our eyes to different questions. And I believe that every question leads to some answer, even if that answer helps eliminate an option or leads to another question that might lead to the elimination of another option. I think that no question should be unasked and no stone unturned. So I thank you for sharing that and expressing that, because I think you're right on the money.
Glad we agree on that. Yeah.
I also
let's rise above.
I also share a love-hate relationship with Harold Bloom that you have, because I agree that the Macbeths are one of the best marriages in all of Shakespeare. And whenever I do a Shakespeare-themed love production, which I just did back in February at a winery near where we live here in Southern Oregon, we did a production called For the Love of Shakespeare. And I always include the Macbeths, and I always give a little introduction there as to why I include the Macbeths. They are passionately in love with each other, and it shows. It comes through. It's just the way that they decide to use it is the problem, right? But that doesn't change the relationship between the two of them. You know, I tend to believe that Kate and Petruchio wind up with one of the greatest marriages in Shakespeare as well, which plays out at the very end in remarkable ways. So yeah, but you know, Bloom, there's a great book. I don't know if you've read it, but he has a great book. It's called Hamlet Poem Unlimited. And that's an awesome, not a very large book. It's a small little book, but that's an awesome book that just dissects Hamlet all on its own. And he does a magnificent job there with that as well, even though I don't agree with everything. And you're right. He is kind of an interesting cat. I think that, you know, he wanted to be Falstaff so badly. I think that was just like
doesn't he?
His number one goal in life was he wanted to be John Falstaff. And I think that's a little odd weirdness about him. But yeah, I think that's funny that you love Harold Bloom.
And yet he cannot see the Tom Nash influence on Falstaff and his crew, you know, somehow. And that's confirmation bias too, I suppose. Bloom, I have read that book you mentioned. It's actually excerpted from his larger book, Shakespeare Invented the Human. And, you know, my book takes the point of view that the humanities created Shakespeare. And the Shakespeare is a product of an excellent education system. And the Stratfordians always argue they call the heretics snobs because we won't admit that there was this rustic who came straight out of Stratford and, you know, and conquered the world. But I think that argument needs to be reframed in terms of education and the importance of the humanities. Shakespeare, whoever he was, arose out of the humanities. He was a Renaissance creature in a small island in which the Renaissance mostly ignored. And until we emphasize the importance of education in Shakespeare, we're creating this myth that really isn't true. You do need an education to create these great works of art. Education is vital and important. And so it's a shame that somebody like Harold Bloom doesn't see that. But on the other hand, Harold Bloom has brought so many people on board to Shakespeare, and he's educated them completely correctly on so many subjects that he's easy to forgive.
Well, I'm from wherever he is, because he's long since passed on now. But from wherever he is, I hope he's hearing your words of praise for him and mine as well.
Oh, he's a father figure.
His name is Lee Durkee, ladies and gentlemen. That's spelled Durkee. His book is Stalking Shakespeare, available now to you. Go out and get a copy as soon as you can. And if you'd like to learn more about what Lee has obsessed over the last several decades of his life with portraiture, you can find his blog, which is Curious Portraits of Dead Elizabethans. Thank you, Lee, so much for taking the time to share your book with me and with my listeners, and for being here on Don't Quill the Messenger and a part of the Quiller Nation.
My pleasure, Stephen. It was a blast. I enjoyed it. Podcasts are fun. So great. Thank you.
Absolutely. It was a blast, and the time flew by so quickly. I know you said that you're looking forward to having Shakespeare in your rearview mirror, so I won't ask you or encourage you about a sequel to the book where you go and find more portraits and do more digging. But do you have something in the works that you'd like to share that's going to be happening for you next?
I am actually facing a blank page for the first time in many years. I went 20 years out of print. So I had this backlog of material. I couldn't publish anything for 20 years after my first novel. And now I'm just getting to the point where I'm facing the blank page again, and I'm looking forward to that. It's exciting to me. I've been reworking a lot of old material, and I want to just get back to the raw creative moment. So I don't have anything in the pipeline right at this moment, no.
Well, best wishes to you, and I hope that some muse falls into your lap and helps you fill that next blank page, because it's a fabulous book. Here I'm holding in my hand. It's a wonderful story. You become, like I said, the hero of the book, and it was joyful to follow you down this journey, and I'd love to follow you down some other journey in the future.
Thanks again, Stephen.
Before we wrap things up here today, I want to remind you once again about our meme contest. Remember, fellow Quillers, send in your creative memes to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com by the end of May to be considered for publication on our social media feeds and a chance to win a free item from our swag shop. Choose a theme for your meme. You can make them profound and philosophical, or historical, or hysterical. You can feature a famous skeptic or a famous quote, use a famous image, or create one of your oat. That was a terrible rhyme. A hard rhyme. A baby rhyme, as Benedict would call it in Much Ado About Nothing. Just have some fun with it and send us your entries. We look forward to receiving them. Once again, I want to shout out to this month's Quiller of the Month, Jen S. Thank you again, Jen, for being a regular patron of the program. And remember, you too can be a winner by becoming a patron at our Patreon page. Just click the red button on the homepage of our website to learn more details. And also, don't forget, join our Quiller News email list by sending me an email to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Keep those comments and suggestions coming as well. I'm a little backed up on answering all of you. I know, but I promise I will get to them as I always do. I promise. But keep them coming. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, fellow Quillers, won't you please go out there and help spread the word? Share this award-winning podcast with others in your immediate realm. Sharing a podcast with someone is as regular today as, say, talking about your favorite TV show in the break room at work. Why not bring up, somebody's talking about binge watching something on Netflix. You can talk about how you binge listened to this podcast recently. Let's keep growing this Quiller Nation around the world. And together, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com. quillernationpodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.